My name is Caitlin Rickert. I'm a student at Georgetown University and an intern here at the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women. I want to take a moment to introduce our next speaker, Mrs. Kelsey Bolar, who will be speaking today on gender ideology and the assault on women. Kelsey is the Director of Storytelling and a Senior Policy Analyst at Independent Women's Forum. She appears frequently on TV and radio shows nationwide, including being a regular guest on Fox News and Fox Business. She's also a Senior Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute and a contributor to the Daily Signal and the Federalist. Her work has been featured in USA Today, Newsweek, the Daily Mail, Fox News, National Review, the Washington Examiner, and many more. I personally really enjoy reading her op-eds, specifically on environmental policy, which you can find on the Independent Women's Forum website. Before Kelsey became the Director of Storytelling and a Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, she worked at the Heritage Foundation as a senior news producer for the Daily Signal, starting there when the Daily Signal was just beginning. She also co-hosted the weekly podcast, Problematic Woman, which challenges the liberal conception of women. The podcast covers everything from reviewing current events to interviewing guests like Abby Roth and Joni Ernst. Kelsey has a wide range of other job experience aside from the Heritage Foundation. She was a freelance editor at Morris Media Group, a digital producer, writer, and editor for a high fashion magazine and the food and wellness section of Fox News magazine. She also worked as a production assistant for Fox News and Fox Business. A fun fact about Kelsey is she actually interned for TLC's show What Not to Wear, working on the production and wardrobe teams. Kelsey is originally from Connecticut and attended Lafayette College, double majoring in film and media and politics and international affairs. She now lives in Northern Virginia with her husband, 2 kids, and her 6-week-old newborn. Before we hear from Kelsey, we will watch one of her short documentary productions.
I had the opportunity to compete at the World Championships in Malaga, Spain in 2018. I had put in so much hard work for this meet, as did my teammates for Team USA. When I got to the meet, I discovered that a biological male was in my race. Not only has this happened to me, but a year later, my daughter ran her first high school race against a biological male identifying as a female. Come on.
It was my first ever high school track meet my freshman year. I ended up taking second in my race next to this biological male, and I would have won my first ever high school track meet if it weren't for this athlete.
I run the 400 meters, which some would say is the hardest race in track. It takes a lot of training, a lot of hard work.
Go, 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 go!
As any athlete would do, I researched my competition before my meet in Spain. I found out that I was going to be competing against a biological male identifying as a female. When I saw the athlete, to my naked eye, I could see that they were definitely taller in stature and had seemingly larger bone mass. When I would ask questions, the team managers, they said, in fact, it would be safer for you to keep your mouth shut. Critics might say, what's the big deal? You won. But just because I won doesn't mean that this is not an issue. My teammate who had worked so hard, I had seen her pour all of her sweat into becoming the world champion, and her spot on the podium was taken by this athlete. A year and a half later, after my competition, my daughter lines up against this biological male in her race.
You could definitely tell they were physically stronger.
This athlete moved from the male volleyball team to the female volleyball team right before track season, and in fact injured one of the other girls in the league by a powerful spike.
I lost out on a chance to win my first ever meet, and it was very disappointing. We heard that they've only been training about 2 weeks beforehand, and I've been training the entire year. I did well, but I could have done so much better, and I could have won my first ever race.
As a coach and as a mother, seeing my daughter put in so many hours of hard work and being restrictive and in her eating, maybe passing on sweets and things like that to make sure that she was strong for her race, it was heartbreaking to see that she was running as fast as she could, and still this athlete breezed right by her. Not only that, but the girls I coach were having major anxiety. One girl was a senior. This was going to be her last season of track and field, and because of COVID, it turned out to be her last race. She actually broke down and started crying. And it wasn't that she was feeling any kind of negative thoughts towards this individual. It was that she knew that all of the hard work and training that she put in would be incomparable to the biological advantage of this powerful athlete. A lot of critics or a lot of people will say, this doesn't happen. This is a rare occasion. This is not really an issue. But what I'm here to say is that it is an issue. It's happening all the time. It's happening to myself, a mom. It's happening to my daughter, a high school athlete. This is not just something that is happening very rarely. I am there as a coach and as a mother. I am witnessing the psychological trauma to athletes like this girl, who then told me she didn't even want to run track for the rest of the season. What was the point, she said. I trained so hard for my event, and I have no chance of winning the conference championship.
I feel so sorry for every girl that has gone through this, and I know so many people are, and I know what it feels like because I've had to go through this experience as well.
There are a lot of psychological studies that say when you believe you can win, you have a better chance of winning. It's the type of neurotransmitters that are firing, but how are these girls supposed to believe that when they're lining up against someone who has a biological advantage? Contrary to what people might think, just because you take hormone therapy doesn't mean that you erase all of the biological advantages of being a male.
I hope to run track in college just as my mom did. It's always been my goal. I hope to maybe win state championships, and I know that if a biological male competes and becomes more powerful and more stronger and runs faster than me, then that opportunity may be taken away from me. A scholarship may go to someone else.
What will happen, especially in collegiate teams, is that a coach will now recruit and take scholarship opportunities away from a female athlete. Coaches at the collegiate level are rewarded for winning. And so these coaches will choose biological males in order to remain competitive in their conference. Where are the spaces for biological females then? What does this mean for equal opportunity for women?
To those who may be doubting that this is really happening, it's happened to both me and my mom, and this is really happening to girls all across the country, all across the world, and opportunities are being taken away.
This pattern is dangerous. It's dangerous because it means the end of female sports. I would say my favorite gold medal would be my World Championship gold medals to run Poland in 2019 indoor championships. And those mean a lot to me. However, they don't mean more to me than this issue. I would rather win this fight for fairness for all female athletes than to get another gold medal. This means more to me than that gold medal. It's easy to place a label on someone, but to walk in their shoes is another story. Have they competed against someone who has a clear biological advantage? Have they trained hours and hours to have a chance for victory? They've told me to be quiet for my own safety, but I won't be quiet. I will continue to speak up. We deserve to be heard.
afternoon, ladies. Thanks for tuning in. That's just a small sampling of the type of mini documentaries that I produce over at Independent Women's Forum. Before I get more into that, I first want to thank CBL for having me today. It is always my honor to join this incredible organization that empowers and lifts up future women, strong women like you all today. And thank you for that very kind introduction. You really dug deep in my bio there, getting back to my intern days at TLC, What Not to Wear. I really had no business being in the fashion industry. That was never intentional. And if my old bosses saw what I am, my $12 Old Navy dress that I'm wearing today to give a speech, they would probably be in tears. I try to learn in every opportunity that comes my way, but maybe I didn't learn enough there. But today I'm going to be talking about gender ideology and the assault on women. And believe it or not, the video that you all just watched was published 2 years ago. And before that, it was 4 years ago when I broke the story at the Daily Signal of Selena Soule, the 16-year-old high school runner from Connecticut who missed qualifying for the New England regionals by 2 spots that were taken by biological boys. Before that, it was 7 years ago when I published the story of kindergarten students in Minnesota being forced to confront gender ideology in order to support a student who is gender non-conforming. These 5 and 6-year-old children were read books such as My Princess Boy, a story that centers on a boy who sometimes likes to do traditional girl things like wear dresses. Back then, this story was somewhat unbelievable to the point that Americans, left, right, and center, didn't believe that it was real. And today, of course, books like My Princess Boy are featured prominently inside school libraries across the country. Just over 1 year ago, I began telling the stories of parents whose children were being secretly transitioned behind parents' backs in schools, along with detransitioners like that of Prisha Mosley, who at 16 years old was put on a path of a medical transition despite a very long history of sexual assault, self-harm, and a severe eating disorder, amongst other mental health issues. When I started this project at Independent Women's Forum, people, including prominent LGBT activists, were still in denial that detransitioners actually exist. But today, detransitioners are some of the most important voices fighting gender ideology. And then just 1 month ago, my colleague and I broke the story of a 12-year-old 6th grader who alleges she was raped inside a girls' school bathroom by a boy, a shocking story in which I'll share more details later on in the speech. The story is the tragic but inevitable conclusion of gender madness. When I was asked to give a speech on gender ideology and the assault on women, I felt compelled to take a look back at some of these stories I have covered over the years in this space. How these stories that I covered went from fringe and fear-mongering to now common and mainstream, to the point we don't even have enough reporters to cover them all. And together, this sampling of stories paints a devastating picture of the harms being perpetrated against women by men in the name of inclusion, tolerance, and compassion. But inclusion, tolerance, and compassion for who? Feminism has been flipped on its head. Instead of fighting gender stereotypes, gender ideology is teaching a generation of children to lean into them. It's teaching them that putting on a dress and wearing makeup is all it takes to qualify as a woman. It is regressive. The attempt by men to appropriate womanhood from girls and women is not just insulting. It is deranged and dangerous, and its consequences are far-reaching, as we'll discuss in more detail today. But first, let me say out loud some hard truths. I consider myself a very kind, deeply empathetic, and compassionate person. Despite being willing to debate policy in public for a living, I don't really like arguing politics with my friends. But I am not afraid to say that there's no such thing as a trans person. There are people, male and female. There are males who identify as female and females who identify as males. However, no amount of high heels, hormones, surgeries, or special pronouns will ever change a person's genetic material. So while many individuals today identify as a trans woman or identify as a trans man, biologically speaking, there are still only two sexes, a fact that must be reflected in both our language and our laws. The story that I told years ago of high school track athlete Selena Soule was really the first of its kind to capture the nation's attention on this issue, as students and parents and politicians woke up to the reality of biological boys taking the place of girls in female sports. Though these stories became more frequent over time, the number of female athletes who were brave enough to speak out about it have not. But for the few athletes who have come out and publicly shared their stories, people are listening. I don't need to recount in detail the story of Riley Gaines, as I'm sure you're well familiar with her race against Leah Thomas, a biological male who had competed for 3 years on UPenn's men's team as Will Thomas before switching to the women's team in 2021. Though the two tied, the NCAA officials told Riley, that the trophy belonged to Thomas. They claimed that this was necessary for public relations. Riley has said, quote, "I can attest to the tears that I witnessed from finishers who missed being named an All-American by one place. I can attest to the extreme discomfort in the locker room from 18-year-old girls exposed to male body parts and having to undress with a male watching in the same room." It is undisputed that the average male is bigger, faster, and stronger than the average female. In almost every sport, allowing males to compete on women's teams or in women's events puts female athletes at a competitive disadvantage. It is for this reason that when it comes to competitive sports, single-sex competitions have long been the norm. The harms caused by males in women's sports is significant and growing. In head-to-head competitions, allowing biologically male athletes into the women's division can severely limit the chances of success for female athletes. On teams with limited roster spots, allowing even just one biological male to participate takes a spot in playing time and potentially future scholarship opportunities away from a female athlete. And in many sports, allowing males to compete against females increases the risk of injury to female athletes. As a mom of a 3-year-old girl, I do not want her physically competing with or against biological boys. As the number of males seeking to compete in women's sports grows, the harms to female athletes also grows. Claims to the contrary deny science, they defy logic, and undermine Title IX, which Congress enacted in 1974 to expand opportunities for girls and women. Thankfully, a majority of Americans support policies that protect the integrity of girls and women's sports. Of course, you wouldn't know this from any of the media coverage of the issue. You also probably wouldn't know that opposing policies that enable children to undergo gender transitions also has a majority support, in addition to having become a sort of litmus test for conservative politicians. 7 years ago, and when I think about it, even 2 years ago, when conservative firebrand Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota, sold out on the women's sports issue in her state, this was an unpopular public position for politicians, even conservative ones, to take. This is strange because both science and public polling has always been on our side, but that goes to show how difficult it is to stand up for the truth on these issues. Remember that when discussing these issues with your non-conservative friends, people probably agree with you on this issue more than you think. 57%, according to a poll conducted by the Washington Post, say a person's gender is determined at birth and can't change. A clear majority of Americans also support restricting so-called gender-affirming care in minors. Despite this, according to publications like the New York Times, the stories of detransitioners, like those we've told as part of Independent Women's Forum's Identity Crisis series, have, quote, fueled the push to restrict gender transition care. This includes puberty blockers for children, cross-sex hormones, and irreversible surgeries. Detransitioners, according to trans activists cited in the Times piece, are distorting the policy debate. While I object to the shameless framing of biased reports such as this, and I would argue that liberal publications such as the New York Times have done far more than any detransitioner to distort public debate in their relentless push to mainstream gender ideology, I also take pride in the fact that as a movement, we've made so much progress in raising the profiles of detransitioners that national media now has no choice but to acknowledge their voices in mere existence. This is a far cry from just 1 year ago, when we embarked on our Identity Crisis series, which tells the stories of detransitioners who warn of the harms of socially and medically transitioning, mothers whose daughters fell victim to gender ideology, and health professionals who are bravely calling out their profession for prioritizing political correctness over public health. Just last December, for example, one activist whose job it is to help LGBTQ plus youth in Colorado made an astonishing claim during a congressional hearing under oath when she said that detransitioning is, quote, not a real thing. Here's exactly what she said. I've just never heard of a case of anyone detransitioning, so I honestly don't think it's a real thing. Again, she told this to lawmakers under oath. Like detransitioners, this perverse and pervasive ideology is not only real, it is becoming a national emergency to address. Men and women, while equally valuable and deserving of equal legal rights, are not the same. Today, that is somehow controversial to say. But the idea that men and women, boys and girls, are interchangeable has become literal according to today's mainstream progressive standards. Gender ideology suggests that people can have gender identities that do not accord to their biological sex, and the medical system offers drugs and procedures to assist people in changing their bodies to match their subjective sense of gender identity. Politicians, activists, and educators have taken upon themselves to actively indoctrinate our children to believe there's something wrong with them if they feel uncomfortable in their own skin. Medical and mental health professionals have built an entire gender industry that profits off the medicalization of otherwise healthy children. Corporate giants like Target top it off by exploiting mental illness and vulnerabilities by marketing breast binders, packing underwear, and apparel filled with transgender propaganda to kids, teens, and even babies. I ask, who among us didn't face insecurities growing up? Who among us didn't want to hide certain body parts at one point, or try on different identities? The difference between then and now is that when I was a kid, we didn't have adults manipulating us to believe that it's possible for a boy to change into a girl or vice versa. Growing up, I was never told that physically changing my body to make permanent a temporary mental state would lead me to fulfillment or joy. Back when I was a kid, doctors didn't prescribe liposuction to treat anorexia, but today, doctors will prescribe a double mastectomy to treat gender dysphoria. It's not just the medicalization of temporary bodily insecurities that's captured our youth. Instead of setting healthy boundaries that allow children to safely explore who they are and who they want to be, schools are pushing children to adopt gender support plans which begin by affirming a child's delusion with opposite sex pronouns. These plans are pushed behind parents' back, betraying what little trust parents could have with their local educators. While using a person's preferred pronouns and new name might sound nice and harmless, affirming a newfound identity is not a neutral, compassionate act. It is an active mental health intervention that poses serious risk to children and adolescents and directly undermines parents' constitutional and privacy rights over their children. Instead of allowing children to naturally explore their identity, it locks in what's otherwise a temporary phase. These plans don't just harm the gender-confused students, they put every girl at risk. Policies promoting gender ideology are actively grooming girls and women to believe that it's normal for men to be in our bathrooms, locker rooms, and safe spaces, when in fact any man who wants to be in a girl's or a woman's space is somewhat deranged and quite possibly a dangerous sexual predator. My critics would call this statement transphobic fearmongering. I wish that were true. I mentioned earlier in this speech that last night I reported a story that I don't believe thus far has garnered enough attention. The story involves a sixth grader at Ask Academy Charter School in New Mexico who was allegedly raped inside the girls' bathroom by an older biological male student. The 12-year-old girl, who I spoke with, alleges that when a male student first entered her restroom, she was washing her hands and didn't take particular notice of the student's sex, nor was she aware of his gender identity. But before she knew it, the male student walked over to her, pinned her against the counter, and wrestled her to the floor. After hitting her head, he allegedly held her down, ripped her pants, and raped her. Again, she was 12 years old. The girl's mom believes the main reason that a male student was alone with her daughter in the bathroom that day and had the opportunity to rape her is because the school had fully embraced gender ideology and trans bathroom policies without her knowledge or consent. According to her daughter, the school fostered an ideologically far-left culture which left little room for dissent. The girl told me that she felt pressured by teachers and faculty to accept the presence of men in women's spaces, to keep her mouth shut about any feelings of discomfort, and to avoid doing anything that would be construed as judging someone who might identify as transgender. Her allegations provide a gruesome example of what can happen when schools open girls' and women's spaces to men and instruct children to embrace an ideology that teaches girls to ignore their natural instincts when female-designated spaces are infiltrated by men. Her allegations also reflect a larger shift happening in society where the feelings and comfort of biological men take precedence over the feelings, safety, and privacy of women. We cannot sit idly by as women are told to keep our mouths shut about feelings of discomfort or to ignore our natural instincts and our legal rights. We must continue telling the stories of forgotten and silenced women that the establishment press refused to believe, let alone report. The stories of female athletes such as Cynthia Monteleone, Selena Sol, and Riley Gaines, who have been unfairly forced to compete against biological males. The stories of detransitioners such as Prisha Mosley and Soren Aldalco, who are still recovering from the medical trauma, irreversible damage, and regret they experienced when medical and mental health providers misled them to believe that changing their bodies would heal their minds. And the stories of female students who are being conditioned to accept the presence of men in their safe spaces and being sexually assaulted as a result. As lawmakers, policymakers, and concerned citizens, it is our responsibility to be a voice for these women. As young, educated, well-informed women like yourselves, it is your responsibility to use your voice. I understand that at times you might have to bite your tongue to save your grades or to secure a job. I've been there. But in the least, you must be willing to stand up for the truth in your private life. When confronted with someone promoting this regressive ideology, you don't need to get into a heated debate. I would encourage you to simply share the stories of the victims like I've shared with you today. When they ask why you won't give into the pronoun game, speak these names, tell their stories. What we're up against is an ideology that supports medicalizing children for life, erasing the term women, rejecting biology and science, and fundamentally changing society as we know it. The implications are far-reaching. As the mother of 3 young children, I know firsthand the challenges that we face in trying to protect our children from the forces surrounding us, pushing this ideology into our schools, onto our children's screens, and into their social lives. I know what it's like to be gaslit to believe that we are the problem for not wanting to undress with biological men present in our locker rooms. I know too well that the only place this ideology leads is to destruction and regret. This brings me to one last story I want to share with you today. And that's the story of Jeanette Cooper, a mother from Chicago who lost custody of her 12-year-old daughter for insisting that her daughter is a girl. After a regular custodial visit to her father's house, Jeanette's daughter decided that she was trans and that she felt unsafe around her mom. In the last 4 years, Jeanette has seen her daughter for a total of 8.5 hours. It's been so long that Jeanette doesn't even know how tall her daughter is anymore. She lives just down the street, but she's only allowed to communicate with her daughter by postal mail. Jeanette, who was the first mom featured in our Identity Crisis series, explained her decision to enter into a legal parenting agreement that strips her of the ability to spend time with her daughter in exchange for a legal commitment that her daughter would not medically transition without a court order or without Jeanette's written permission. It's a choice that no loving parent should be forced to make, and it's reflective of the ways in which gender ideology has become a destructive force in society, severing the most fundamental bonds in life, that between a mother and her daughter, all under the guise of protecting children. Here's what Jeanette said. I see that my child is at sea in a boat. She is struggling. She is in tumultuous seas. I know that. I have seen that. And what I have been told is to follow her lead, to follow her in this journey. I am not willing to do that. I don't think that is good parenting. It is my responsibility not to hook my boat to hers. It is my responsibility to be a lighthouse, to be something stable that she can see, some guide that she has, that will always be there, that is consistent. And that is my responsibility. I still do that today, even though I have no custody of her. I have no medical decision-making, no educational decision-making, and no way to communicate with her other than by mail. I don't have her phone number. I know where she lives, but I'm not allowed to go there. I know where she goes to school, and I'm not allowed there either. But this is parenting. What I'm doing, even though I have no real contact with her, I am still her parent, I am still her mother, and I am still parenting now. Fighting gender madness requires a multi-layered strategic approach. Humorous takes on public figures such as Dylan Mulvaney, who make a mockery of what it means to be a woman, are certainly part of that effort. But even more important is that our critics understand that our work to defeat gender ideology and protect women is grounded in compassion and concern. Compassion for those suffering from gender confusion, and concern for the ways they've been manipulated, mutilated, and mistreated. And the ways in which we've all been misled to believe that the feelings of biological men take precedence over the feelings and physical safety of girls. As women, we've taken up this cause not because it's a political win, but because we care about protecting women and preserving the truth. I thank you all for being a part of that.
Anyone has questions? Questions from 15 minutes.
Run up here.
Thank you so much for speaking. I hosted an event on my campus a few months ago with Concerned Women for America, talking about this issue, what a woman is. And I was kind of surprised at the people that were there sort of in protest. They were straight, white, so-called Christians, females, and they were biological females. And they weren't part of any of the LGBTQ community. Can you explain why that's happening, that some of the pushback are people that aren't even part of this group?
Yeah, some of us call them like Lululemon women marching on the street. So I think what you need to remember is that the majority is on our side, and the polls have consistently over the years reflected that. It doesn't often feel that way when you see how the media covers this issue and when you see the protests, and you're, in your case, probably literally screamed at. But you know, how many of those protesters were there? Just because they're speaking the loudest doesn't mean they are the loudest voices in that they don't reflect the majority of Americans on this issue. I think it's more common to find those types of women and girls on college campuses because so much of this ideology was formed on college campuses, and it's the professors who are indoctrinating children and young adults with this. And when professors kind of instruct and motivate students to speak out on this, that's when you're going to find some of those loud activist voices. It's it's very intentional. I think it's unethical for the way that the academic class frames this issue as if what conservatives, or not even just conservatives, but common sense Americans are promoting and pushing back on this gender madness. They're really trying to frame it as a life or death issue for trans kids. And if that really were the case, then yeah, we should be out there picketing and screaming and being loud and obnoxious. And that's what they're doing because these women are being misled by authorities, adults, professors who they trust. And so I would just give you encouragement in the face of that type of backlash and protest, and find comfort in the fact that the vast majority of Americans agree with you. It's sometimes shocking to me to read these polls, but it shouldn't be. Like, I know how the media covers this issue, and I know how the academic class writes about it. I do believe the tides are shifting, and the truth about the medical side of this is being exposed. One of I think the most effective counterpoints on this issue when debating medical transitions is to ask your counterparts, why are the vast majority of European countries banning so-called gender-affirming care? Why are they not performing these procedures on minors? And that's because they've conducted systematic reviews of the evidence, and the evidence is not on their side to support putting minors on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or severing healthy body parts. Unfortunately, in America, we're behind, but those same people who are fighting to allow children to go on cross-sex hormones are the same people who will applaud, Denmark and Sweden for their progressive policies. Well, then why aren't they listening to them on this? They've conducted the reviews. I think the tide is shifting, but you still need a lot of encouragement, because if you're brave enough to host an event that's going to cover this issue on your own campus, yeah, you're going to face that type of loud, obnoxious, loud and obnoxious backlash.
Hi, I have a little bit of a different question. My little brother's football team ended up playing a team in their league where there was a girl on the team, and she wasn't transitioned, but my little brother's team had to give up points and give up ground because they wouldn't tackle her. And so I'm just curious what your take is on women in traditionally male sports breaking gender norms that way, and how we should be responding to that.
Well, it's interesting, those types of stories aren't as common and aren't garnering the type of backlash, obviously, because it's an entirely different conversation when we're talking about girls competing in boys sports. It goes from being a conversation about fairness to more of a conversation about safety. And I actually think so much, rightly so, of this conversation is focused on the effects on biological girls and women, but we shouldn't leave boys out, because their feelings matter too. And the vast majority of boys don't want to be competing with girls. They don't want to be putting a girl in the position of physically harming them, which is exactly why we got that result where they're giving up points, because they don't want to hurt a girl. That is how men should act. They should be applauded for that. And quite frankly, they should protest being forced to compete with girls, because absolutely they can physically harm them. And that's obvious. Like, nobody's going to come up and fight that and debate you on that. But there's a huge double standard when it comes to boys competing in girls' sports. But I will note the stories of girls being injured by biological boys competing in our sports are becoming more common. This is something I noticed early on. It was referenced by Cynthia, and there's more to that story where a biological male volleyball player who's identifying as trans competing on the girls' team spiked and allegedly gave another girl a concussion. And then at IW, we've partnered with more young women who have been physically hurt by boys. I mean, it's wild to me that any mother or father would want to put their daughter at risk in competing with and against biological boys. The injury factor is such an important aspect of this conversation, and for so long it was being written off. But and it's very convenient when trans-identified men, such as Leah Thomas, choose to compete in a sport like swimming where there isn't physical contact. The more men that compete in sports that entail physical contact, the more injuries that are going to happen and the more backlash this is going to face. But we shouldn't have to risk any girl getting injured in order to end this. It should end now.
Hi, thanks so much. So with like the emergence of like so-called gender-affirming language like chest feeding and like blanketing, how can we as college-age women, do you have any advice on how we can push back against those terms and how we can kind of take back traditional like ways to say those kind of things?
Yeah, having just given birth to my third child and still nursing him now, that term is personally offensive. I'll tell you, even, I'm kind of protected from cancel culture, having chosen a career where I can speak publicly about this issue. But even in my work, part of what I do is get op-eds placed at different news publications, and I'm not going to name names, but one very prominent news publication changed the term women when I was referring to women giving birth. This was back during COVID when they were trying to force COVID shots on pregnant women. They tried to change my terminology to pregnant people, and so I can understand personally how intimidating it can be to push back on this. I had to do that, and I do this for a living. But words matter and truth matters. And if we're going to forgo that ground in our everyday lives, of course, it's a lost battle in the legal world, in the policy world. So words and language matter, and I would encourage all of you to not give into the pronoun game, to not accept anybody changing the terms breastfeeding to chest feeding. There's no there's no such thing as a male nursing, and in that one case that's been going viral, I mean, that is child abuse. If you look at what the drugs that male has taken in order to produce something that is not actually breast milk. And, I reference the preferred pronouns and dangers of accepting those terms in my speech, but I want to reiterate, like when I started covering this issue, I was very tempted to use a person's preferred pronouns because I did not want to offend someone. I didn't want to offend Caitlyn Jenner if Caitlyn Jenner heard me talking publicly about him. But the more I learned about where these preferred pronouns lead, the more I learned that it is not a kind act to embrace preferred pronouns, and it is not even a neutral act, because embracing preferred pronouns puts children directly on the path of medical transition. So think back to when you were a kid and maybe you begged your parents to let you take a certain class or participate in a certain sport that your parents didn't want to let you, but you convinced everyone that this was the right decision for you, and then you start playing that sport and it turns out you actually hate it. it's actually like kind of hard and embarrassing to go back to your parents and go back to all your friends and say, oh no, like I don't want to do that anymore. I like what I was doing before. Well, imagine if you had convinced everyone around you to call you a boy and to use male pronouns. That's not easy to do in the first place. And then when everybody around you is going along with it, imagine how difficult it would be to go to them and say, never mind. I mean, it's embarrassing. And so that's why we shouldn't embrace it, because it's really difficult for children to turn back from there. And studies reflect this, that when you embrace a child's preferred pronouns, they are far more likely to go on to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. And so anytime somebody asks you to do that, just remind yourself where this leads. Cross-sex hormones, and it's the effects of them are detrimental. I really, if you haven't heard of it, I really encourage you to check out our series Identity Crisis at Independent Women's Forum, where I produced a series of videos like the one you watched on women's sports, telling the stories of detransitioners who detail the medical harms that they are still experiencing after detransitioning due to the years of cross-sex hormones. They are not reversible. We hear so much about fertility, the effects on fertility, and it is absolutely awful, the prospect of sterilizing children. But what's, I guess, a little more difficult to say out loud and talk about is the fact that these puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones also, in most cases, are preventing these, when they become adults, preventing these individuals from experiencing orgasms, which is a part of being human. And why would anybody want to strip a child of that ability in their future? I know these conversations are hard to have, but when you embrace preferred pronouns, that is the future you are putting these children on. And I personally want no part in that.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Shanae Mitchell. I go to Clemson, and thank you so much for what you shared. So I have two younger brothers, and you talk about Target having the pet-friendly swimsuits and such. So how do I stand in the way of this attack of the left? It seems like they're really doing it to these young men, and that they are also huge victims of this too. So why do you think the left has been so successful in getting young men to join up, and what should we do?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one I've been thinking about more now that I have two little boys. And when I was younger, it used to be girls that we were worried about and wanting to encourage and champion. And now it's really young boys and men who are being lost. If you look statistically, women, which is awesome, reflected in this room, are disproportionately the ones who now hold college degrees and, are obtaining jobs and all this. But it shouldn't be an either or. We want men to succeed too. And unfortunately, a lot of the success of women is being pushed at the expense of men. It shouldn't be an either or. It should be a both and. And unfortunately, this whole movement is pitting men against women in an unhealthy way. We want and need men to be allies and partners of women. We don't want we don't want to be enemies. So I guess I would that take a step back from that question and look at societies and more, the left and establishment media's message to young boys and men, which is very demasculizing. And, I really do think we're in kind of a boyhood crisis. There's been a lot of good books on this that I'm actually starting to dive into myself, again, as a mom of two little boys. But I think one of the most effective ways to communicate to boys and girls on this issue is to show them the harms of this movement, to show them how a seemingly harmless shirt from Target can result in irreversible damages to boys, girls, men, and women. And again, these conversations can be hard, and nobody wants to be labeled as intolerant or a bigot. And that is why I love storytelling, because I don't have to convince you, I don't have to debate you on this. I can just share a story and ask you to respond to it. Send a link of some of these detransitioners to listen to their stories, so that when your brother asks, well, what is wrong with this shirt at Target? You can say, well, look where this ideology led this young girl. That is why I am concerned about what Target is promoting, because it seems harmless, but real girls, women, men, and boys have been harmed by this, and it has to stop. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I always love coming to speak at this event, and I hope that you all are encouraged to speak up when you can, be brave and courageous, and know that the polls are on your side. The majority of Americans agree with you on this.